it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. The Vietnam War was arguably the most traumatic experience for the United States in the 20th century. Now, that is indeed a grim distinction in a span that included 2 world wars, the assassinations of 2 presidents, and the resignation of another. The Great Depression, the Cold War, racial unrest, and the drug and crime waves. 1971, the Vietnam experience. 1971 and 1972. The years go by. Nixon was president. The Godfather movie was released. Libertarians had their first convention, and I was drafted for military service. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was 18 and had just graduated high school in May. My mother and father were there to see me released into the world of hard work and dedication. However, that was not the case, as I decided to fight for a cause, and signed up for the army in June of 1972. After 3 months of boot camp, learning how to fight hand-to-hand combat, and weapons training, I was shipped off from my boot camp in my home of Travis County, Texas, to San Diego to be deployed. While in San Diego, I was shipped on a plane to a mysterious land known as Vietnam. I'd only heard about the mysteries of Vietnam in the local news. There was mostly stories about missing in action and prisoners of war in the North Vietnam camps which I'd heard about. These men were found deep in the jungle, slaughtered to death by the red evil known as the Viet Cong. However, I still continued with no regrets, thinking I was going to fight for the freedom of the Vietnamese people from an evil cause and liberate them for the better good of the world. Going from San Diego to Vietnam was a harsh plane ride, especially with all the storms going across the Pacific Ocean. However, to pass the time, I talked to some of the other fellows from the plane. First was a guy from Austin, Texas, known as Paul. Well, Paul was an 18-year-old high school flunk who decided that his only path after school was to go into the army. Paul's choice of employment had made him a happy man with really no real problems. There was also a kid from California named Carson, who was from Stockton. Carson was of half Vietnamese, half Irish descent, and decided to fight for the South Vietnamese cause. He spoke fluent Vietnamese and English from his mother's side. He'd always be cracking swear words in Vietnamese. He obviously was the quirkiest kid from the group, being this 20-something fellow who always cracked jokes to make everyone feel better. I soon befriended these fellows, and we were the best of buddies by the end of the flight. We arrived at the military base in Saigon and were allowed a few days to roam the city before the deployment into the jungle. While time was on my side, I ventured into the streets of Saigon. I stumbled on an old bookstore. I took a peek inside, and it revealed thousands of books, mostly written in Vietnamese. The woman behind the counter looked at me, and then went to the back. I decided to look at the folklore section, which was full of stories told by locals and traditions past. I then saw a book in English which looked a little worn, and decided to take a peek. I opened up to one page and found the image of a frightening dragon with large red eyes. I wasn't scared, but decided to read the story anyways. It mostly talked about a dragon which roamed the jungle looking for prey unless someone offered a sacrifice. After reading it, I thought it was the cheesiest story I'd ever laid eyes on. However, as I turned around, the shopkeeper looked at me and said politely in English, "You better walk with your eyes open in those trees," and then walked away. I was kind of confused, but just walked out and proceeded to the base. After a few days in Saigon, we were given our mission, and being privates, we'd be the first ones in to search for the Viet Cong and would investigate the local jungles nearby the border, most notably for missing prisoners within the thick jungle. Me and about 200 other men were shipped off in jeeps to the battle zone, specifically the border between North and South Vietnam. Arriving at our destination, well, it was a very quiet place. Nothing but the chirps of small birds in the distance. It was a large, ancient jungle which didn't seem to be of anything really. The man in charge told us to get ready and set up camp, which we promptly did. His name was Sergeant Rogers. He was a ripped guy who had to be over 250 pounds. He walked like he had to be doing something at all times, but was not one of those yell-at-your-face fellas. Instead, he treated the men in his brigade as if he was another soldier, just giving orders. After a few hours of setup, Carson, Paul and I were sent off to investigate the thick jungle. Grabbing our guns, we quietly walked through the middle of the jungle, scouting for anything that we could see. The place was quiet, and we heard nothing but the chirping of bugs in the distance and the occasional bird. If it wasn't for the war that was going on here, this would be a beautiful vacationing spot. After a few hours of scouting and seeing nothing, we headed back to base camp, but not before Carson saw something crude in the distance. Well, it looked to be like something man-made, like a big rock building of some sort. We then approached the huge building only to find that it was a large abandoned temple of sorts. We walked up to the temple, thinking something could be in there, but then we heard footsteps and someone yelling something in Vietnamese a few 100 feet away. It was the Viet Cong. We then hurried back to camp and told our superiors the story of finding some temple in the middle of the jungle. Well, he just laughed and said that those are old Buddhist temples which had long been forgotten. Well, even though our superior didn't care, we were still deeply interested in these temples. Another day went by and we were picked again to scout out the jungle. Well, this time we decided to venture deeper into the thickness of the vines and trees. After a few miles of venturing in the jungle, we saw a camp of the Reds. It was an encampment of a few 100 men, which by this point were just a mere 100 yards from us. We just looked at them and at their entire encampment, not seeing any prisoners. We scoured the thickness of the jungle for a few hours, writing the daily log of what we'd seen and reported it back to Rogers, mainly just how many troops we'd seen, how far away it was, and so on. We stayed at the side of the camp for a few hours, when a red soldier approached, in the distance, not seeing us. He pulled something out of his pocket, and we were ready for the worst, but it was just a Zippo lighter, and he'd gone out for a smoke. Well, Carson was hyped up to capture this guy, and he had a plan. We'd go up to the soldier, gag him, and try to get any information about the missing soldiers. We decided to put this plan into full effect and try to get anything we could out of this soldier. We surrounded the guy on all sides, slowly approaching him in a quiet fashion. He was about 20 feet away from us now, and all we could smell was the cigarette burning rapidly. Slowly walking as close as I could finally see the orange part of his burning cigarette as he took it from his mouth. I then grabbed my pistol and rag and went behind him, grabbing him and gagging him. He was letting out muffled screams for help, but I wasn't going to let him go. Well, Carson and Paul held him down, but he was still screaming for us to let him go. Carson then told the man, with a knife to his neck, in Vietnamese, that if he screamed once, he'd cut his neck wide open. The man went quiet at this, sweating bullets out of fear for his life. Carson then started talking to the man in his native tongue, asking all the information that he knew. The man and Carson talked for about 5 minutes until Carson, in disgust, let the man down and then beat him with the butt of his gun, leaving the man unconscious so we could get away. We then started on the ferocious hike back to camp, tired and covered in mud from the jungle. I then popped the question about what the man had said. Carson, who was mad, blankly said, "The man said there is no prisoner of war camp near this area, and that the man from their encampment have disappeared as well, thinking it was an American POW camp." I was dumbfounded at this, thinking that we'd not had any disappearances since coming to the jungle, but that we'd also not captured any enemies since we got here either. We continued the walk back, and I was speechless as we walked to the encampment. The three of us went to Roger's tent and explained to him that there were no prisoners at the camp, and told him about the soldier. Rogers was almost as confused as us, but then gave us orders to head back to our quarters, as if something was bothering him. His face, while we were just staring at him, was red mad, as if someone had just murdered his wife. He then proceeded to yell at us to get back to our quarters, and we scurried back to our beds. Paul asked, why was Rogers so infuriated with us? We did our job and scouted the enemy. What else does he want? Well, I don't know, Paul. I think Rogers is hiding something from us and the other troops, Carson explained. Oh, that trooper at the res camp also said something about a serpent-like creature when the disappearances occurred. Why didn't you say anything about that to Rogers? I asked. He's never going to believe us. Plus, I think there's a lot more to learn about the jungle, Carson exclaimed. Okay, look, we'll talk more in the morning, I sighed. No, we cannot let anyone else know about this, Paul yelled out. Carson hesitated and then said to us, well, let's just keep this to ourselves for now. If something does happen, then we'll be ready for it. The three of us then shook on it, agreeing that we would not talk about it again, and proceeded nervously to the bunks. A few days passed by, and we were preparing to advance towards the North Vietnamese camp that we'd spotted earlier. Rogers explained that this would be a routine mission, and we'd be going deep into the jungle to attack the enemy. Rogers had a nervous look on his face, but he was ready to send the troops into battle. We grabbed our guns and supplies and set off walking through the jungle once again. Our first job was to clear a path by removing trees and other debris, mostly with construction equipment and flamethrowers. Carson and I were put on flamethrower duty, and Paul was put on clearing the debris. We spent another few hours clearing trees and rocks before setting up camp deep within the forest. We began setting up sandbags and digging holes, preparing for the attack. And that's when we saw the Vietnamese. There was a counterattack force only a few hundred yards away. We grabbed our guns, and a firefight soon engulfed the two forces. We battled deep into the night. Bullets were grazing past me and Paul as we reloaded our guns. Paul had killed about a dozen of the enemy before Rogers yelled out for the big guns. I was lucky if I'd even shot one or two of the guys. This was my first battle with real people. The grappling guns began firing on the enemy, as many of the Vietnamese were underpowered in terms of weapons and were running at us. We began taking them down with all the firepower we had. We began to cheer, but it wasn't long before more of those Reds kept coming through the trees. Their dead bodies were just piling on top of each other, and they had this evil look in their eyes. And then everything started to fall apart. Snipers in the trees began to pick us off one by one, killing the many good men around me. Paul was grazed in the leg, and then Rogers yelled out for us to retreat. All of us began to fall back as more and more bodies from our side began to fall. By then, Rogers was already off the battlefield, and most of the survivors were running towards the south. I then heard Paul crying out. He'd been shot in the leg. I grabbed him and put him over my shoulder, with Carson giving us cover fire. By this point we were almost surrounded and began to run eastward. I then shouted to the others that the temple could be our place of refuge until the enemy had left. So we slowly dragged Paul to the temple, which was a long 2-mile walk. We then saw the temple in the moonlight, with its ancient vegetation growing all over the old stone walls. I could hear shouting behind us as we ran into the temple, but it was dark and quiet for most of the night. Well, I took a look outside to find a few of the Reds looking at me, seeing that I was in the temple, but, well, they looked terrified with blank expressions on their faces. They ran off shouting something in Vietnamese, and they were yelling out, "Con Rong, Con Rong." Confused and more than just a little pissed off, I sprayed a bunch of bullets to ward them off, and then ran back into our temporary fortress. I then said to Carson that those bastards were gone, and they were running for their lives back into the jungle, not telling him what they'd said. Carson was busy tending to Paul's wounds, which weren't too bad, but he still couldn't walk on his own. I proceeded to make my way through the old temple to get a feel for what kind of surroundings we were in. Mostly what I found were statues of some fellow I didn't know and paintings of dragons everywhere. The drawings depicted people running out of the temple into a jungle being chased by this dragon-like creature. The creature was yellow with red eyes and a red stripe, and it had sharp teeth and a sinister-looking face, like it was ready to devour someone. I then walked deeper into the temple, with my lighter guiding me, looking at all these paintings of this dragon, which would do anything from sitting on top of some temple to devouring people. I was deeply impressed by these drawings. Then I heard a large bump at the end of the corridor. It was Carson. He then looked at the drawings and was shocked by their contents. He said they were from, some local dragon legend. According to Carson, the Vietnamese, like many East Asian cultures, were extremely intertwined with the dragon in their stories. He didn't know this particular story, but he said that dragons in Vietnamese culture were often said to be bringers of rain, particularly in agriculture. He also said that they really believed the dragon to be a father figure to men, and it was even included in their creation stories. They signified that they brought much good to the world, but this dragon was very different from the ones in Vietnamese folklore. He said that this dragon was evil and was a vicious killer, not like the loving creatures typically depicted. Just as he was about to explain more, we heard screams coming from Paul in the distance. We ran back to him, and he explained that something was growling at him in the distance. We looked outside to see the silhouette of something in the distance, just staring at us with these big red eyes. It looked like some large bird with the body of a worm. It was growling and had a huge snout like a lion. It was hunched over the body of a man who was screaming for his very life as this monster started eating him from his torso. The creature ripped flesh and tissue from the man, swallowing his intestines like spaghetti. It then turned around and growled at us from outside the temple and began waving its wings. It then flew off. We then saw its face as it tried to break into the temple, looking for something to eat or kill. We ran deeper into the temple, into a large atrium, and stayed there for a few hours, hearing the creature's snarls and its screeches. It was screaming and banging on the walls of the temple, trying to get to us, so we just remained in the atrium. More hours passed, and it went silent for a while. We could hear the occasional bird. I picked up my lighter and made a makeshift fire with pieces of cloth and leaves. I then noticed the same silhouette of something in the background. I hopped back, thinking it was some beast, but it was a statue of the same dragon, covered in gold and ruby. Carson explained. Whoever was here didn't just fear this creature, they also worshipped it. I then walked towards the back of the atrium and noticed a room going to the back of the temple. It went to a long line of stairs which proceeded to a room with an opening big enough to fit the dragon. Inside the room there were drawings of dragons everywhere, and a large altar big enough for a human to be sacrificed. It was covered in dirt and leaves, but it was definitely for sacrifices, as I found plenty of daggers nearby made of gold. It was then I heard a hiss above me and saw the dragon coming down with its claws ready. It lunged for me and scratched me deep on the leg. I heard its musky breath from the other side of the cavern. It let out a roar, and I could smell the stench of rotten flesh within its mouth. It then tried to grab me from the corner of the room. I ran to the open door, back to the atrium, but not before it was able to grab my leg. With its claws digging deep within my skin, I let out a shriek and then grabbed my revolver from its holster and shot it in the arm. It shrieked and yelled at this, and I saw this as an opportunity to get out of there. I crawled back to the open door and escaped the beast by climbing back to the atrium where my colleagues were waiting. We waited for daylight to come, which seemed like an eternity. Paul's bleeding was stopped, and then we picked him up and proceeded to walk out of the temple to civilization. My eyes then adjusted to the incoming daylight as we swiftly walked out of the temple towards the American camp. Well, we walked for what seemed like hours, only to find a crew of mangled corpses of Vietnamese troops near a large tanker truck. They looked like they'd been ripped to shreds, but by nothing man-made. One of the men was ripped in half at the torso and missing his lower half. Another man was missing his body and only his head was left. Something had taken down an entire battalion of Vietnamese. We knew what had done this, but we weren't going to stay around for confirmation. We began to check the bodies and look for any necessary supplies, finding water and some painkillers. I suddenly heard in the distance a faint cry for help. We walked in awe towards the dying man. He was yelling out that word in Vietnamese again. Con Rong. Carson then talked with the man, who was saying words about a serpent with wings and how it ambushed them. He talked with us for a few more minutes about this creature, which would just not die, and that this creature severed a huge gash in his leg in an incoming attack which happened just a few hours ago. He was able to survive for a while longer, but kept blanking in and out of consciousness. He then began going into shock, but kept shouting the same word until he died. Gone wrong. Gone wrong. By that point I was sick to my stomach and throwing up whatever content was in my body, trying to understand what the hell was going on. All I wanted to do was go home and never see this shit again. I was as sick as I could be. I grabbed a swig of water from my canteen, which was halfway full. We then searched through the entire tank, before leaving the mangled bodies and corpses behind on our way back to camp. We walked for what seemed like hours, stopping only to give ourselves a short break and carrying Paul, who was okay for the time being. His leg, however, started to show signs of infection. Then we finally saw the familiar sight of an American Jeep in the distance, hoping that someone out here was still alive. Well, we finally made it back to the American camp, which seemed to be all but abandoned. The Jeeps and even the tents were all but abandoned within the area, and most everything was charred like it had been in a fire. And then we found the corpses, just like at the Vietnamese camp. Charred remains of men were all over the place, half-eaten men with their innards scattered. It was a disaster zone. We then began walking through the entire encampment trying to find some life, when we saw a handful of Americans, including Rogers. Rogers was loading up gasoline into a large Jeep with a few injured and a few healthy people, all getting ready to leave. We started yelling at Rogers that we were okay, as he yelled back and waved us to come along. We dragged Paul to the Jeep and put him in gently. Many of the men in the Jeep looked injured, including Rogers, who appeared to be scared out of his mind. He then told us that everyone in the battalion was dead apart from us, and we were lucky to be alive. He later said that no one else was alive, including the Vietnamese. He then paused and said, "After the retreat, we ran towards the base camp area, where we settled in before, and stopped there for prep work in the morning. And something came from the distance and began to attack us. God, that thing was everywhere, slaying troops one by one with his big red eyes and his bloody teeth. It was flying around our Jeeps and stopping anyone from leaving, charring men, cooking them to death, ripping other men apart piece by piece. We ran into the nearby forest and hid in a small cave until the thing left. That's when I began finding survivors, and then I found this Jeep." We began talking then about our encounters with this creature, and how it had killed many men along the way. By the time we'd finished explaining all of our stories, we'd reached a small town outside of Saigon and went to the nearest American military post. And that's where my story ends. After that horrible encounter, all 12 of us were relieved of our military duty due to PTSD, and were never given an explanation about that serpent. We were flown back to the United States and then sent to a mental health division of the VA. There, the doctors said that the dragon was just a result of the stress we'd endured. But, well, I know what I saw. After the scramble, we all went our separate ways. As for the others, well, those few that survived, I only know what happened to Paul, Rogers, and Carson. Paul, after returning home, had his leg amputated. He lived a nice life until he began having flashbacks of that dragon and the temple, and he was later admitted into a mental health clinic in 1984, where he died a year later. Rogers, after returning home, worked at a local grocery store where he later became the manager. However, due to constant headaches and hearing voices, he committed suicide in 1995, leaving a suicide note about how he was hearing noises from outside his window and seeing red eyes all around him. As for Carson, he still contacts me and after returning home got his degree in Eastern Religious Studies from the University of Michigan. He's still researching about the dragon in the tomb and has implied he might go back to Vietnam to try and solve the mystery of the murders. As for all the other men slaughtered by the dragon, well, I don't know. It was never explained to me what happened to the many people who perished there. In the end, I still know what I saw, and I know the other 2 men saw what I saw too. Well, that thing still stalks me in my dreams. The doctors from the VA still say that it's stress, the stress of being in the war, but I know what I saw and it was not a hallucination. I know that thing is still out there waiting to kill me, waiting to skin me alive, waiting to rip me apart with its razor-sharp teeth and its blood-red eyes. And it'll still be waiting for me in my dreams. Still waiting. Well, a short but sweet one for you this evening. And the main reason is because, oh my god, it is hot here. I'm sweltering in my little office studio, and about a half-hour story is all I could really manage today. Whew. I know a lot of you are also suffering from the heat, but we'll get through it together, I hope. So yeah, I've got so many longer stories, 2-3 hour long ones, lined up for you, and yeah, very excited about them. But I just can't be in the office too long. But yeah, on Monday, got a really big one. It's going to be nearly 3 hours long, and it's a follow-up to one that I did fairly recently here on the channel. It's from the author of The White Van Man and Mr. Xander. Okay, so it's a follow-up of the serial killer story, so I think it's going to be, well, I'm really looking forward to it. I've started recording it already, and it's going to be really something special. I hope you're going to enjoy that. And, so yeah, because I'm doing that, Sunday night will be a compilation, scary stories told in the rain kind of thing, 3-4 hours of stuff I've done recently that wasn't so popular, so it's going to be like a long fall asleep to these stories told in the rain kind of thing on Sunday, and then a biggie on Monday. Is that okay to you? Hope so. Well, I'm sweating buckets here, so that's enough for me for one evening. You'll stay safe out there, keep cool, and enjoy your weekend. Till the next time. Sweet dreams and bye-bye.